So, a sort of funny story about the making of biblical womanhood is that I was on a book club Zoom meeting, and one woman, all of the women were going around and telling me what the book meant to them. And this one woman stood up and she said, I bought the book because I didn't see the subtitle. And I thought that it was actually about how to be a better biblical woman. And she said, I was really surprised when I started reading it. But then she said she kept reading it. And by the time she got to the end of the book, she had a different understanding of what women were called to be in the church. So how did we get to the point where biblical womanhood, the idea that women are called, ordained eternally to follow the leadership of men as part of the gospel of Jesus? Chapter 7 pulls many of these threads together. And the first way that we got here is simply by forgetting about women's leadership. Now, for those of you who remember, in the book, I talk about a small little church outside of Waco called First Baptist 𝙬𝙬𝙬𝙬. As I'm recording this, the church is coming up on its 143rd anniversary. It is one of the oldest churches in the area. It is also a church that has a very long tradition of women in leadership. I talked about one woman who came and preached at the church during a revival service and was called not only once, but was actually called 3 times. And she was described by the church as being a great soul winner. One of her sermons was, "Is it well with your soul?" And it brought not only one of the largest crowds that First Baptist 𝙬𝙬𝙬𝙬 had ever had up to that point, but it also saw the most people give their lives over to Jesus than it had recorded up to that time. But that wasn't the only strong female leadership that we saw in First Baptist 𝙬𝙬𝙬𝙬. I have right here in my hand a document that was begun on January 24th, 1904. And it is the first of a series of meeting notes from the Ladies' Aid Society, which eventually became the Women's Missionary Union. And this group was probably the strongest committee, the most influential group in First Baptist 𝙬𝙬𝙬𝙬. In fact, after having read through all of the documents of the church, they did a lot more than the deacon body ever did. In fact, at the century mark of the church, of the history of the church, one of the leaders wrote a history of First Baptist 𝙬𝙬𝙬𝙬. And it's really interesting that this is what he says. He says, we have to recognize the fact that female members are a very important part of this church. So important that they asked for recognition in this little historical sketch of the church. I really love that, because not only do we have women who are important in the church, but they understand their importance, and so they asked to be included. And in fact, they were included. And at the end of the section, it says, let me add a personal word to the credit of these women. I am sure that if the male members had been as busy and as energetic and as much in earnest as the women of our church, it would be difficult to tell what would have been the result. Another thing, let it be said that they have gotten away from the practice of raising money by suppers, quiltings, etc., and now operate the Bible plan. May God richly bless the work of our women. First Baptist 𝙬𝙬𝙬𝙬, for much of its history, was kept alive and thriving because of the female leaders in the church. But if you walk into the foyer of the church today and you look on the wall and you see the commemorative plaques, you won't see any of these women's names. You will only see the list of the pastors And all of the officially called pastors of the church have been men. So women's leadership is almost completely obscured, despite how important a role they played in the church itself. How did we get to women's subordination being included in the gospel of Christ? One of the ways is simply by forgetting not only the leadership of women in the Bible, but also the leadership of women in church history, and not just in the ancient and the medieval world, but all the way up to a church that has only been around for 143 years. And I'm a medieval historian, so that means it's really young. Second way that we got to the subordination of women becoming a part of the gospel was through weaponizing our understanding of the Bible. Now, I've gotten into a lot of trouble over talking about inerrancy in the Making of Biblical Womanhood, so I just wanted to clarify a little bit what I meant. And for those of you who don't know, in 1978, a group of learned scholars, as well as pastors, ministry leaders, got together and they wrote what is called the doctrine of inerrancy. And this is part of it. It says, being holy and verbally God-given, Scripture is without error or fault in all its teaching, no less in what it states about God's acts and creations, about the events of world history, and about its own literary origins under God, than in its witness to God's saving grace in individual lives. The authority of Scripture is inescapably impaired if this total divine inerrancy is in any way limited or disregarded or made relative to a view of truth contrary to the Bible's own. And such lapses bring serious loss to both the individual and the church. Now, I don't know the motives of the folk who wrote the doctrine of inerrancy, although I do know a lot of their names. And a lot of them, I think, would be really shocked if they saw how the doctrine of inerrancy has been used today. And what I argue in the Making of Biblical Womanhood is that the doctrine of inerrancy has become not so much about the Bible, but has become about a certain interpretation of the Bible. This is weaponizing inerrancy, because if you don't believe in female subordination, if you believe the Bible teaches something different from that, has a different vision for women, then that means that you are on the slippery slope away from Orthodox Christianity. We forgot women, we weaponized inerrancy, and the final thing that we did, which is the most egregious of them all, is we wrote the subordination of women into the Godhead itself. What does this mean? This means that those who believe in complementarianism have also tried to rewrite Christian theology about the Trinity. They have revived an old heresy, changed it a bit, and argued that the Godhead, that hierarchy exists in the Godhead. Why did they do this? One of my favorite scholars who talks about this is a man named Kevin Giles. And in his book, The Trinity and Subordinationism, he tells us, page 115, he writes, the recent impetus to understand the Trinity as equal in divinity but subordinate in function of role has risen exclusively in the context of arguing for the permanent subordination of women, not in the context of a review of the history of the doctrine or a reconsideration of biblical texts and their historical interpretation relating to our understanding of the Trinity. In virtually every aspect of this hierarchical presentation of Trinitarian theology, the determining force is not the Bible. It is the desire to maintain the headship of men. As I wrote in the Making of Biblical Womanhood, in their absolute desire, mad power grab to enforce the permanent authority of men over women in home and family, and really as that extends out into culture. They not only wrote women out of the Bible, but they also weaponized the Bible, used inerrancy to weaponize the Bible. If you do not believe in the subordination of women, you do not believe the Bible as well as I do. And then finally, instead of conforming to be more like God, they tried to make God look like them and argued for the subordination of women in the household because Jesus was always subordinate to God the Father. This is the most egregious aspect, I think, of the making of biblical womanhood, is that we did exactly what God has called out, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Instead of trying to become more like God, we have tried to make God look more like us. Kevin Giles rightly calls this out as idolatry.